Hi, in this video, we're going to talk about our paper, If You Must Choose Among Your Children, Pick the Right One. This is joint work with Brittany Fasy and David Millman. I'm Brad McCoy. I'm going to give the first part of the talk describing some background and the problem, and then Ben Holmgren will give the second part describing our contribution. And we are all at Montana State University. So our title maybe deserves an explanation, but that'll become clear during Ben's part of the talk. So this is a Morse theory talk. So legally, we're required to talk about the height function on the torus. So for smooth Morse theory, we have a mapping from a manifold to the real numbers. So we see a mapping from the torus to the reals here. People are often interested in counting and classifying critical points. So for the torus, we see 4 critical points. And we can classify critical points in terms of their index. Roughly speaking, the index is the number of directions we can move downward. So for this critical point in the bottom, we have an index of 0. So there's no direction we can go that is down from this point. At this next critical point is of index 1, because there's one linearly independent direction that goes down, shown here. This next critical point is also of index 1. And finally, at the top, we have a critical point of index 2. So there's 2 dimensions of downward direction shown here. Points that are not critical are called regular. And at each regular point, we can assign a gradient vector. So this gives us a gradient vector field on our manifold. And there's lots of other interesting things one could say about smooth Morse theory. Maybe the Morse inequalities will be interesting to us. So the number of critical points of index I gives an upper bound on the ith Betti number. So for example, here we have 1 critical point of index 2. So that tells us that the second Betti number of the torus is less than or equal to 1. So we're going to talk about discrete Morse theory. So here our topological space is a simplicial complex. There's 3 ways we can think about a discrete Morse function. The first way we'll call algebraically is a function from the simplices to the reals that satisfies these 2 inequalities. So roughly speaking, this is saying as you increase in dimension, your function values also increase with at most 1 exception per simplex. So for example, this vertex labeled 4, we can look at incident edges. So we have one labeled with function value 6 and one with function value 3. So the edge with function value 3 would be the exception here. And this leads to what we call a topological flavor. So we can pair simplices with this exception, and that gives us what we call gradient vector field on the simplicial complex. This is called a topological flavor because you can remove any of these pairings without changing the topology. So for example, if we remove this edge face pair, we'll end up with this V shape, but we haven't changed the number of connected components or cycles or voids or anything like that. And we can continue removing things until we're just left with one vertex, which has the same topology as our triangle here. Our third flavor is combinatorial. So we can think of a discrete Morse function as a matching on the Hasse diagram, the directed Hasse diagram. So initially everything is directed downwards, and then when we pair simplices, we direct those edges upwards. And we're not going to have no cycles in this directed Hasse diagram because we have a gradient vector field. So in the literature, it's often illuminating and very cool to switch back and forth between flavors. So if you switch flavors, oftentimes you can learn something new. So that's pretty cool. And the Hasse diagram is a graph, so one can apply graph theory algorithms, which there's a lot of graph theory algorithms, so that can also be a useful thing to do. Okay, so the problem we consider is if we have a simplicial complex generated from point data, the function values are already assigned to the vertices. So we'd like to construct a discrete Morse function that minimizes the number of critical simplices and agrees with the data, the function values on the vertices. So here we see a simplicial complex with function values already assigned to the vertices, and we could put a gradient vector field on that complex. So that's our problem. King, Knudson, and Mramor give an algorithm to do exactly this. So the title of their algorithm is extract. So our input is a simplicial complex and an injective function from the vertices to the reals, and we'll generate a discrete Morse function that agrees with these function values on the vertices. Their algorithm consists of two sub-algorithms, extract raw and extract cancel. Extract raw generates a discrete Morse function with potentially too many critical points, and then extract cancel goes through and cancels as many out as possible. Our work mainly focuses on extract raw. So extract raw includes a recursive call on the lower link. So recall the link of a vertex is the closed star minus the star. And for high dimensions, this can get expensive. So if you have a d-dimensional simplicial complex, there's always one vertex where the lower link will be a d-1 dimensional simplicial complex. So if we compute these things recursively, that can get expensive. So our work is try to make a local decision that removes the need from this recursive call. So for example, if we have this tetrahedron here, when we select the vertex 3, the lower link is going to be this triangle 0, 1, 2 shown here. Okay, so Ben's going to tell us how we can avoid this recursive call and describe our algorithm.
Great. Thanks, Brad. My name's Ben Holmgren. I'm going to be giving the second half of the talk, and I'm going to give a little bit more intuition on some of the important properties of extract raw that we show in the paper. And then I'm going to provide our main contribution, which is an algorithm we call extract right child, which should sound a little familiar from the title. So to start off, we show that extract raw produces a gradient vector field consistent with that initial function on the vertices, where kind of the function value of every simplex is determined by its largest function valued component vertex. The gradient vector field is consistent with this function valuing as we go up in dimension. And we also show, importantly, that all of the arrows on this gradient vector field occur based off of just lexicographical orderings in the Hasse diagram. What ends up falling out of all of these recursions is just matchings that happen kind of between the smallest parent nodes on the Hasse diagram and their corresponding largest lexicographically valued children based off of this initial function. So definitely to help visualize, say our simplicial complex were this little cycle on the left, and here's its corresponding Hasse diagram. Every single matching in extract raw is just happening between the smallest parent nodes and their corresponding largest children lexicographically based off of this function. So if we were visualizing everything as being ordered kind of from left to right, the leftmost parent is always being kind of matched to the rightmost child. So we're always choosing the rightmost child, and that's kind of where this funky name is coming from. And the rightmost child is always going to be kind of the tail of an arrow, and the parent is always going to be the head of an arrow. And we also show that this is a really restrictive output. There is exactly one gradient vector field that sticks to both this consistency with the function and also this continual matching between kind of leftmost parents and rightmost children. And so knowing this, we can actually just design an algorithm that uses this property instead of using all of these recursions. So the first thing we're going to do then in our algorithm, which we call extract right child, which seeks out to do this, is we're going to go through every node in the Hasse diagram, and we're going to store the function value of the largest component vertex of every simplex, and then its rightmost child node, and also its leftmost parent node. And then we're going to just carry out matchings the exact same way that they would have been done in extract raw, where the smallest parent is going to be the head of an arrow, and the largest child is going to be the tail of every arrow. And then everything that's kind of left over we call critical in the very end. So to visualize here, if this were our simplicial complex on the left, this cat-shaped thing, and on the right over here, we have our corresponding Hasse diagram, after we've marched through and stored all of the data of all of the kind of function values and all of the, you know, corresponding rightmost children and leftmost parents, we just go through from the highest dimension down and we say, okay, what is the rightmost child of whatever simplex we're on? Well, for 3, 4, 6 here, its largest lexicographically valued child is 4, 6. And then we check to see if 3, 4, 6 is 4, 6's leftmost kind of smallest lexicographically valued parent. And it is. So we have kind of our first matching. And correspondingly, on the actual simplicial complex for that equivalent definition, all that's going on is we have an arrow going from 4, 6 into 3, 4, 6. So the tail of the arrow is going to be 4, 6. 3, 4, 6 is going to be the head. And the same thing then is going to happen with 2, 5, 7. 5, 7 is going to be the tail. 2, 5, 7 is going to be the head. And then we move down in dimension. So 3, 4 is going to be paired with 4. 1, 5 is going to be paired with 5. And then we hit kind of our first danger zone area where 2, 5 is not the smallest lexicographical parent of its largest lexicographical child. So we must call it critical. So 2, 5 is going to be our first critical cell. And on the actual simplicial complex, we show that in red over here on the left. Then moving along, 1, 6 is going to be paired with 6. 3, 6 we have to call critical for the same reason. It's not the leftmost parent of its rightmost child, sort of in this left to right visualization here. 4, 6 we've already called a tail, so we can skip over it. 2, 7 is going to be the head, and then 7 is going to be the tail of another arrow. 4, 7 we have to call critical for the same reason, since 7 has kind of already been claimed by 2, 7, its smallest parent. And then 5, 7 is already been called a tail, so we're all good. Then we move down to the vertices, and every vertex that we haven't already called a tail, we just call critical. So 1, 2, and 3 in this example, we're all going to call critical. For an idea then, also of the runtime, extract right child is going to run in big O of dn time, where d is the dimension of the Hasse diagram and n is the number of total simplices. And we're going to use O of n space. And kind of the expensive step here is just that decoration step in the beginning, where we have to end up kind of storing at every node the function value and then the leftmost parent and the rightmost child. And then for an idea of the runtime of extract raw is lower bounded by n squared log n. And we find this because basically what we end up having to do is something just as hard as computing the homology of these subcomplexes that are fed in recursively. And we know then that computing the homology of something is n squared log n, lower bounded by n squared log n. And so that's where we find this, which is the same, time complexity as matrix multiplication, which is lower bounded by n squared log n. And then its space complexity is unknown, but we do have really clearly then a nice time complexity improvement from extract raw. And so to summarize, if we're given some pre-existing point data on a simplicial complex, and we want some function to inform us about its topology, we can also equivalently do this with a gradient vector field on a simplicial complex and actually combinatorially on a Hasse diagram. And there are already algorithms to do this, but if we look at them combinatorially, they have these lexicographical orderings that are kind of determining actually all of the matchings that are going on. And so if we actually end up exploiting this property in our algorithm, we get some really nice time complexity improvements in the end. So to visualize, if this is our simplicial complex, we're going for kind of a first pass here. You know, we're not going to get a lot of the time this perfect gradient vector field that we kind of want at the very end, but we can do a really fast, good, like kind of initial pass to get some idea of what a gradient vector field could be on this simplicial complex. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about what we're doing here, Brad and I are more than happy to talk to you via email. And thank you so much again. I hope you enjoyed our contribution.